Welcome today, Sunday, our second day. How many is this the first time at NEAF for you folks? Well, let me tell you, you're going to be in for some treat today. Welcome to NEAF. We certainly hope you have a great time. We have a wonderful program set up for you today. And our first speaker that we have for you today is an exceptional imager. He's written several hundred articles in professional magazines, successfully shot images of our solar system, and I'm so proud and extremely happy to welcome our first speaker today to NEAF. Please give a big round of applause welcoming Robert Reeves to NEAF 2017. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, I'm from Texas, so I'm obligated to say howdy. And if you all are ever down Texas way at the Texas Star Party, I'd be pleased to see you there. Texas Star Party is my hometown event, and it's coming up here at the end of May, and you all are always welcome down there. Moonlover's Guide to the Bright Sky. I took my first moon image back in 1959, and since then I drifted into deep sky and did all sorts of astrophotography, but I've always come back to the moon. It's my first love, and I'm making an effort to repopularize the moon. The moon kind of drifted away out of the amateur's realm. Amateur astronomy started going to deep sky, galaxies and nebula, and we kind of ignore the moon nowadays. It's the big bright thing in the sky that keeps us from doing deep sky, but it's not. It's the big bright thing in the sky we can do when we can't do deep sky. You can do the moon from your backyard. You don't have to travel 100 miles or however long it takes you to get to Cherry Springs up at this part of the country. The moon is something you can do anytime the weather allows from your backyard. And I'm going to show you what the amateur astronomer can do with modest equipment. All of my moon pictures are taken with 7 to 11-inch aperture telescopes, but you'll see that they outshoot what the professional did back in the Apollo era. So I'm overrunning my own talk and not catching up on my slides, so pardon me if I'm a little excited. This is the first time I've spoken here at NEAF, and this is a really big deal. But pressing on, I've had a love affair for over 60 years with the moon, and I love talking about it. And I hope when I'm finished you will see the moon in a slightly different light, not the big bright thing that keeps you from the deep sky, but a target that you should go to and embrace and explore and enjoy and understand. Because there's so much on the moon that we can see. You can see more detail on the moon with the naked eye than you can see on a planet through a telescope. A little bit of optical aid, and you see geology on the moon that is amazing. So let me ask you a question. How many of you are children of the space age, born before Sputnik, and you grew up with the space age and the excitement of when we first started going to the moon? The probes that we sent to the moon back in the 60s were having such a hard time getting there. And then finally, NASA got their act together and we started having success after success of exploring the moon, finally landed a man on the moon. How many of you remember the surprise of Yuri Gagarin in orbit? Beat the Americans into space. It was a big deal back then, the space race. It was almost as much politics as it was science. Then, of course, the pride when John Glenn went into orbit and brought America into space. Finally, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, did his one small step for mankind. Back then, American heroes rode a pillar of fire and dared to set foot on another world. And that's the same world we can explore ourselves with our own telescopes. If you understand what you're looking at on the moon, have a basic understanding of the geology, what created the features on the moon, it's a much more exciting place to explore. The moon is not just a world full of holes, big craters. It's a dynamic world that changes from night to night, almost hour to hour, and I'll show you what you can see through a telescope, what you can image. I'm going to give you basics of how I acquire these images, it's not really hard. It's a simple process. You just go through the steps using fairly inexpensive equipment, and a lot of it is freeware. Photoshop is the only thing that's really cost, but now that Photoshop is a $10 a month subscription, I no longer accept the argument from people that I give talks to all over the country about astrophotography. I don't accept the argument that Photoshop is too expensive. You can't afford it. Well, you can afford it at $10 a month. It levels the playing field, so everybody can do this kind of work. Back in the 60s, the moon was a big deal. It was a destination. It was something that was national goal. It was a world to be explored. And the moon was a big deal to the amateur community. It was a place that inspired us to enter astronomy to begin with. Frankly, if the moon didn't exist, I might not be an amateur astronomer today. The moon is my love. I love promoting it. And I hope a little bit of this rubs off on you when we're finished with the talk today. There's a specific word that describes me. Selenophile, a person who loves the moon. And I hope you will be too. Now, the process of imaging the moon can be intimidating if you don't know exactly how to go about this, but I'm going to go through a few basic steps. This is not going to be a tutorial or a workshop type situation. I'm just going to introduce you to the basics of it so you see how easy it really is. There's no big deal to get really great professional level quality images of the moon. Let me backtrack, and those of you who don't know me, give you a little bit of my background, how I got into this, being an astrophotographer. 40 years in the film era, I was shooting the moon, shooting deep sky. I used to do an enormous amount of film photography. Ended up writing a book called Wide Field Astrophotography. It was quite popular, and it expanded the realm of astrophotography. But then the film era died. Just almost overnight, digital photography took over. So, of course, had to write another book, Introduction to Digital Astrophotography. And I like to think that that helped popularize and spread astrophotography to where it is today. Back in the old days, you go to a star party, there were very few imagers struggling along with their film cameras and long exposures. Now you go to a star party, almost everybody has a DSLR looking up. And I like to think I had a small part of that. And to clarify, yes, I do deep sky astrophotography. I'm not solely a lunar guy. I very much enjoy getting out and exposing the Milky Way. About 15 years ago, there was an entire paradigm shift in how we image solar system objects. The webcam revolution came around. And being an old school astrophotographer myself, initially I was skeptical. A simple little webcam, this tiny little black and white camera, can outshoot what we do with all of this high technology film stuff. And I was, like I said, I was skeptical, but then I tried it myself. And the very first image I took of the moon so overwhelmed me, the quality of it, the jump in clarity of what you can get using a simple webcam over the old film days. It inspired me to write another book, Introduction to Webcam Astrophotography. And I like to think that the popularization of that technology through my book and talking about it inspired the industry to create these dedicated solar system cameras that the various manufacturers put out. Along the way, my images ended up on the covers of books. They ended up in books. If you have the beloved Turn Left at Orion by Caucasus Mountains, well, you have my moon pictures. They're in there. I've been on the covers of magazine, my moon pictures. I've been in magazines. So anything I can do to spread the word about this. One thing that I'm really proud of, though, is people buy my large format moon prints to take to astronaut autograph shows. So I'm very proud that my moon pictures have the autographs of all the people except Neil Armstrong. He didn't do that kind of stuff. All the people who've walked on the moon have signed my moon pictures. I wish I had one of those pictures, but I'm real happy that people use them and like it for that. Now, some of you may even be sitting on one of my moon pictures. If you have the iPhone 7 case that has a lunar image on it, that's my lunar image. Now, I've spent an enormous amount of time chasing large telescopes all over the Southwest to take pictures of the moon. And I came to a realization that that was a waste of time. Invariably, I could go back home to my own observatory on top of my garage with my own small telescope and take better pictures of the moon than I could with these big instruments that I've been chasing all over the Southwest. The reason is the atmosphere. Large aperture telescopes look through more turbulent atmosphere than a small telescope. Theoretically, large telescopes have higher resolution because greater the aperture, the greater the resolution. But they're also looking through more turbulent atmosphere, and it degrades the image. So a 8-inch telescope will often outperform a 24-inch telescope on the moon. So that was a hard-won lesson. And now I do all of my lunar imaging from home and find that I'm doing a much better job of it. My old, almost 45-year-old C8 does remarkable. It can see kilometer resolution on the moon. I upgraded to a Celestron 11, but at that point I had to actually put an observatory building up there to house it because that would be too heavy to take up on a ladder every night. And was doing grand work with that. Most of the pictures I'm going to be showing you here were taken with this telescope. And lately I've actually downsized. I've gone down to a Skywatcher 180 millimeter Maksutov, and that does wonderful on the moon as well. So the point is, you don't need a big telescope to image the moon. Big telescopes can sometimes be a detriment. Me and my telescope, well, it's like me and my gal. Been married to my wife 37 years, and they're both dear to my heart. This is the business end of it. I use the Celestron Skyris cameras to do my imaging. I've gone through the iteration of the 274 and the 132, and now I use the 236, a large pixel array camera with a fairly small micron, 2.8 micron pixels, which really give good resolution on the moon. So, in a nutshell, I like to say that I have no special talent here, but I am passionately curious. And just like you all, if you're here today, you're curious too. You want to explore, you want to understand, and just seeking out new knowledge, new techniques, exploring new parts of the cosmos. That's what it's all about. I don't have a professional degree in astronomy. It's just 50 years of passion. You pick up a lot, and you will too if you your curiosity takes you out there. So the moon is my playground, and I invite you to come out and play with me. So a little bit about, well, this slide has become obsolete since I've arrived here. I was going to tell you if you want a tutorial on how I do my lunar imaging, come on over to the Celestron booth or the Hotech booth. I'm dashing back and forth between the two of them, and I'll give you a copy of a lunar imaging tutorial, but they're gone. I'm sorry. They're already gone. But let me say that this tutorial is also on the International Observe the Moon website hosted by the Goddard Space Flight Center. So you can get the full 12-page download from them. This image I took specifically for this talk in the library of my home. The image on the left is a shot I took of the Theophilus and Cyrillus region through a C11, and the image on the right is a page out of the Kuiper Photographic Lunar Atlas. That was the pinnacle of lunar research in the early 60s, when we were just beginning to go to the moon or beginning to prepare the Apollo missions. This was the best we could do from Earth with telescopes like the 100-inch Mount Wilson, the big refractors at Yerkes and Lick, the telescopes on Pic du Midi in France. These were the best lunar imaging telescopes in the world, yet a Celestron 11 today just blows that out of the water. So that's a comparison that I want to show you that you are capable of taking better lunar images than the pros used to be able to do back in the heyday of the Apollo era. There's a number of steps that I go through to do my lunar imaging, and the first one is the telescope has to be collimated. The best telescope in the world will not give fine, high resolution if the optics aren't in order and the mechanical alignment of all the components. So I use a Hotech advanced CT laser collimator. You've seen them over on the floor at NEAF. Use that to align the optics. Get the secondary mirror lined up, get the corrector plate centered, get the optical collimation or optical alignment, mechanical alignment of the focuser all square so that the optic system is perfect. How I capture the images? I use a freeware program called FireCapture. It interfaces with the drivers that come with the various cameras, with ZWO, QHY, Celestron, Skyris. It works with all of them. And a little laser pointer work. I like this program because the various features that allow you to control the image capture process. If you're doing the moon, you want full frame. If you're doing a planet, shooting Jupiter or Saturn, of course, you want to use what they call region of interest. You get to crop the image down to just tightly around the planet, so you're not recording video of black space. You don't need that. So you have controls up here to select full frame or ROI. Here's your exposure controls where you set the gain, the exposure time, the gamma of the exposure. It's got a full suite of file naming and exposure controls where you can customize it to record the videos in with any file name that you want, so you can keep track of things. I like this particular feature because it monitors the RAM and hard drive capacity. It essentially tells you how much film you have left. Because when we're doing these videos of the moon, I will end up with AVI videos that are 11 gigabytes long. So high hard drive capacity is a must, but you can chew that up quick. I do 20 images of the moon, I've used up my solid state hard drive. So having that essentially a film counter lets me know what my status is. The histogram up here, it's essential to use a histogram to set the exposure on your lunar images, because at night when you're looking at a laptop in the dark, the bright glare of the laptop is going to fool you. Your eyes are dazzled, so you need help determining the exposure. And if you use the histogram function, it will help you nail the exposure regardless of how bright or how dazzled the screen is. Now, I use the highest frame rate available, of course, for capturing. Set the camera, or set the software to record 60 frames per second. We do this because we need the most number of individual video frames possible within a short period of time, because atmospheric seeing is always moving. You've looked through the telescope at the moon, it's shaking and quivering. You see the heat waves in the atmosphere. Well, a certain number of those frames are going to be better than others, just statistically. So I set a very high frame rate so I can quickly capture many, many frames, and then the software that processes it selects the best of those and processes and stacks those. My personal preference is to set the software, video capture software, to record 5,000 frames. And of that, I will stack the best 500 into a single image using additional software. And I think 5,000 frames is an awful lot, but at 50 frames per second, that's only 100 seconds. So the actual image of the moon is recorded in 100 seconds, and that'll give me a 5,000 frame video file that it's about 11 gigabytes in size. Now, how to expose for the moon using this software. I set the gain at mid-range, and then I vary the exposure slider until the histogram just barely bumps up against the right-hand side of the histogram box. You don't want to pile everything up against the right-hand side, because that's saturating the pixels to bright white. And once you have a fully saturated pixel, there's no detail in it. So you got to keep that histogram balanced so that you're not overly saturating the image. The later versions of the image capture software allow you to control the gamma of the picture as well, and that puzzles a lot of people exactly where to set that. Well, there's a simple way to figure out where to put it when you look at the histogram, and this particular slide was taken when I had the camera laying in my lap, so I don't have an actual moon image in there to show, but pretend that we've got a normal histogram with a full hump all the way across. You adjust the gamma until there's no vertical black spikes in the histogram itself. You want the whole thing to be smooth. So you run the gamma slider back and forth until there's the least number of vertical spikes in the histogram, then you're set. Okay. Once we capture that big video, we need to process it down into a single AVI file, a single TIFF file, one picture. And that's done in a freeware program called AutoStackert. And AutoStackert will import the video. You adjust various parameters within the program, and it will divide the picture up into almost 6,000, or at least with my camera, with the pixel array on my camera, into almost 6,000 individual little segments. And it'll analyze all of those individual little segments on each frame, decide which one is the best quality, and grade them from best to worst, so that when it stacks those images into a single image, all those video frames into a single image, it throws away the ones that are no good. It'll pick the very best. And it does this automatically. It takes about 6 minutes to grind through a video like that using my i5 laptop to create a single image out of that entire video file. So it's not a complex process. It's very automated. The software does it for you. So we end up with a raw TIFF output that a single frame that's stacked out of 500 video frames, the best of 5,000. And this image I took on March 15th from my home in San Antonio, and we're going to run it through the various processing steps. First thing you do, the big secret that makes me look better than I am when I'm doing lunar imaging, is run it through the Photoshop shake reduction filter. That's a fairly new filter in Photoshop. I don't know which version it was introduced, but it's in the subscription Creative Cloud version of Photoshop. The shake reduction filter does a marvelous job on the moon. It makes the image look like it was taken through either a bigger telescope or under much better seeing conditions than you had. The next step is, crop off the borders. During the image acquisition process, the image kind of shimmers around on the camera sensor over the course of 100 seconds, and that creates kind of a raggedy edge around the picture, kind of like old analog television snow. So we got to crop that off and get rid of it. Next thing, you rotate the image so north is up. I'm a big proponent of north up on the moon. We show the moon like it is on a terrestrial map. There's lots of confusion in older books where they present the moon upside down. And that's the way it was done until 1960. In 1960, we flipped the moon to north up. Next step is using the camera raw filter in Photoshop to adjust the exposure if you need to lighten things, to brighten dark areas, the shadows, to drive the black regions down to pure black. There are no gray shadows on the moon. That's one of my big bugaboos. You see enormous amounts of excellent pictures posted on Facebook, lunar pictures posted on Facebook, but they're not fully processed. They run them through the stacking process, and that's it. They think they're finished. All of these Photoshop steps are what separates a good data image that's a mediocre presentation to an excellent professional level image that you'd be proud of. there's, like I said, there's a lot of pictures out there where the data is good, really good. I'd be proud to have that picture to finish processing it, but they stop at that point. My big push for people doing lunar imaging is to complete the process, do the final steps to really sharpen up the image, get rid of all of this noise in the gray areas, make black shadows black. Another thing that I push is that there are no central peaks in craters less than 10 miles in diameter on the moon, yet the stacking process and the sharpening process creates those artifacts. We have to get rid of those. You have to understand what's real and what's not real on the moon. Anyway, moving on. The next big secret in processing lunar images is enlarge the image. I enlarged it to 300 dpi to fit a full-size print, 8.5 by 11 size print. And by enlarging it, now we can see all the artifacts in it that are degrading the image. Shadows are not gray. Shadows are black on the moon. And the processing, the image stacking and processing process creates artifacts within craters, creates false central peaks. It creates false parallel detail next to real linear detail. And all of these have to be eliminated one by one using Photoshop. It's a process. It takes about a half an hour per image. And people kind of look at me and say, well, have to do all that work? Well, what about the deep sky imagers who process an image, take longer to process a deep sky image than it actually took to take the image? And they're out there exposing for hours. It's just part of the deal. It's part of being an astrophotographer, to make the very best presentation you can do. So going back and forth, I hope it shows on screen, but you can see how much of an improvement the image is when we get rid of all of these artifacts. So we go from a raw image that looks like this out of the camera to an image that is sharpened, all the tones are set, all the artifacts are out of it, and now it looks like something that is in a professional journal. For the rest of the show, I'm just going to give you a tour of the moon to show you what is up there, what are the sights, what's the geology up there, what's the big draw, what makes my heart beat when I look through a telescope and see this world of the moon that's just almost within our reach. It's only 250,000 miles away. I've got more mileage on my car than that, and it's the closest world to us, and it's beckoning to us right there in our own backyard. First up, anybody recognize Mare Australe, down on the southeastern part of the moon near the limb? This is one of the lunar seas, but it doesn't look like a lunar sea we're used to. We're used to the lunar seas looking like the big, broad, dark spots that make the face of the man on the moon. Australe is a collection of lava-flooded craters. This image I'm rather proud of. Let me show you something. See that little mountain peak up there? Here we have the craters Hercules and Atlas, lava-flooded Endymion. This is Mare Humboldtianum, right on the edge of the moon. But that mountain peak is on the far side of the moon. I can tell you the geologic coordinates on the moon of that mountain peak are 100 degrees east longitude. And you think a minute, wait a minute, we only see the front half of the moon, and that 90 degrees longitude is the edge of the moon, 100 degrees is back on the far side. Well, that's the central peak of the crater Compton. It is located at 100 degrees east longitude, so you can see some of the far side of the moon from the Earth. It's kind of fascinating to realize that's on the hidden side of the moon that had our imagination fired for centuries. We never could see the far side of the moon until the space age. Mare Crisium. This is the first lunar sea we see when the phases of the moon go through the crescent and advance toward first quarter. We see the Cheshire cat smile of a crescent moon above the western horizon. And as the phases get bigger and bigger, circular bar Crisium is the first lunar sea we see. And it's like a big, giant, unwinking eye staring back at us. I've always wondered what ancient people thought of that thing. I mean, how much religion, how much superstition was inspired by this eyeball staring back at us here on Earth. Sunset on Mare Crisium. And look at the folds of Dorsum Opal, where the shadows, low sunset shadows, are revealing detail we normally can't see. The Terminator reveals all of the details that you can't see when the moon is flatly lit. The full moon may be romantic, but it's the most washed out detail, the phase that shows the least amount of detail. My mantra is follow the shadows. The Rayeta Valley down on the southeast part of the moon, this giant gorge, has a dogleg in it, but the whole thing is referred to as the Rayeta Valley, and it's the remnants of what happened when the Nectaris Basin was formed 3.9 billion years ago. These gigantic mountain-sized blocks of material flew out from the crater and tumbled across the face of the moon, gouged out these huge gorges. The Rayeta Valley is actually two separate features. The upper part is the true Rayeta Valley. This one down here would take a dogleg. It's created by another event. So I call this the Mallet Valley, named after the crater Mallet. But collectively it's called the Rayeta Valley.
What's a dogleg?
A dogleg is where something will take a turn, a bend. The crater is a Hercules and Atlas, like I said, following the sunset. The deep shadows give a sense of drama. It almost turns lunar photographs into art. And Colombo and Gutenberg, named after famous people. All the craters on the moon are named after people who have had profound influence on our life, philosophers, scientists, inventors. So the crater Gutenberg and Colombo named after Christopher Columbus, of course, discovered the New World. Now this picture is there simply just for fun. It's Lacus Mortis. Lacus Mortis, this circular feature here, they call it the Lake of Death on the moon, Lacus Mortis. And the crater Berg right in the middle creates a bullseye effect. But look what the sunrise shadows have done. We've got Batman on the moon. Modern lunar imaging using small telescopes like I use is so good that now we can see little volcanoes all over the moon. See the Shield volcano here, even got a little caldera on it. There's one here, another over here. Here's one up at the top. These are called lunar domes. They're actual volcanoes, but on the moon, they form shallow pancake volcanoes, much like, well, what created the Hawaiian Islands. They're not steep-sided, tall mountainous volcanoes like Mount Vesuvius. These lunar domes are all over the moon, and they were really hard to see in the old days. People would study and try and track them down visually, but when we're doing this photography, we're so good at it nowadays, they just pop up all over the moon. And this is the crater Janssen, the biggest crater you almost can't see. So many people overlook this thing because it's so huge. I mean, they look at Fabricius in the middle of it and think they found something, but it's laying inside of an even huger 200-kilometer wide crater. And what's fascinating about it is this scimitar-shaped rill, this crack running through the middle of it. The geology on the moon is remarkable. We don't see stuff like that here on Earth. Our weather erases such geologic features, but they're preserved on the moon and will last billions of years. The Nectaris Basin, Mare Nectaris. Theophilus Crater up here, Fracas Taurus Crater down here. And we're going to zoom in a little bit on Fracas Taurus. And you see it's kind of like a horseshoe bay on the moon. The Fracas Taurus formed on the rim of the Nectaris Basin, which later flooded with lava and became Mare Nectaris. the Sea of Nectar on the moon. But a crater on the edge of the basin is on a slope, so the inward side is lower than the outboard side, so when the lava flooded the basin, it flooded into the crater and created a horseshoe bay. Now, keep an eye on Fracas Taurus here, particularly this little crater here that's overlapping it, and we'll go deeper into the lunar night. Look what happens to Fracas Taurus now. You can't even recognize it. The moon does change from night to night. It's different. It's dynamic. It presents a different face. Sometimes I can't even recognize familiar craters because we're following the shadow, following the drama, following the really dynamic, changing part of it that makes it so interesting. And the same thing with Patiscus and Hole Mill. They're fairly common, ordinary-looking craters when they're fully illuminated, but when they hit the shadow like this, they're very dramatic. This is Posey Dounia, up on the corner of the Sea of Serenity. Sea of Serenity forms part of the man on the moon's right eye. Posey Dounia looks different than most craters. The interior looks like an oatmeal cookie. This is a class of crater we call floor-fractured crater, where volcanic uplift has pushed up the bottom of the crater from below and cracked and split the surface. Floor-fractured craters are full of rills and cracks that make it very dramatic. Then we raise our spaceship orbit a little bit from a higher altitude. Here's Posey Dounia again, but now we see the Serpentine Ridge. The Serpentine Ridge at this is sunrise. Very low sun elevation creates dramatic shadows on the moon. Now the Serpentine Ridge, one of the longest features on the moon, almost 400 kilometers long, but it's one of the more shallow ones too. No part of it is probably more than 200 meters in elevation. We wouldn't even be able to see it unless these deep shadows were making the sunrise grazing across the top of it, and the shadow behind it accentuates it. So as the sunrise terminator or the sunset terminator sweeps across the moon, that's the area of the moon you want to watch. You want to follow the shadows to get the detail of the drama. Theophilus, Cyrillus, Catharina. This is that picture that I was holding up comparing to the Lunar Atlas earlier. The resolution on this is less than a kilometer. If I had walked into the University of Chicago in 1960 with this picture in my hand, I would have owned lunar research for the next decade. But time has not caught up with us yet. The Altai Scarp, the Great Wall on the moon. This is actually the outer rim of one of the basins on the moon, the Nectaris Basin. And the lunar seas that we see that create the face of the man on the moon all lie within great basins. And a basin on the moon is basically a giant crater. And these outer rims are, this particular wall is the outer rim of that giant basin. Any crater on the moon larger than 300 kilometers in diameter is considered to be a basin. Here's a ghost crater, a crater you can't see at all. This is Lamont on the Sea of Tranquility. And to place where you are on the Sea of Tranquility, the Apollo 11 landing site is right here. But Lamont is this crater here, this circular ridge structure. These radial ridges that radiate out from it are a different geologic feature. But Lamont was formed almost 3.8 billion years ago, and the lava that flooded into the Tranquillitatis Basin completely covered it up, leaving only the ridges that show where it used to be. So we call this kind of crater a ghost crater. Marius Serenitatis, the Sea of Serenity, it's got two-toned lavas. It's tough to explain this, but along the shore, very dark lavas. Toward the center, very light lavas. And what created this sharp demarcation is up for a bit of debate. Still following the shadow. Here we've got Aristoteles and Eudoxus, but up here, who says craters are round? We've got this very strange square-shaped crater. W Bond is the name of it. Not all craters around. And my flying saucer is getting ready to land. Here is Aristotle and Eudoxus again, all shot with a Celestron 11. Poor Stoffler and Maurolycus down in the south-central part of the moon. They're formed about 4 billion years ago. And Stoffler over here settled in for a nice long winter's nap, and then all heck broke loose. The Great Basins were formed and showered huge amounts of debris across the face of the moon. So it filled in Stoffler, flattened it, we can't even see its central peak anymore, and then another crater crashed down on it, and then another one on top of that, and another one on top of that, and another one on top of that. Just boom, boom, boom. We've got pancake layers of craters. It's fun to trace down these layers of craters and see who is on top of who, because the one that's on top is the youngest. You can trace back through geologic periods of time on the moon by tracing out the layering of things. Mountains on the moon. These are the Caucasus Mountains that separate Mare Imbrium from Mare Serenitatis, basically separating the left and right eyes of the man on the moon. Everybody loves the Alpine Valley. If you've ever watched the moon about first quarter, this little gash off by the edge of Mare Imbrium, and you know you got really good seeing when you can see that little rill running down the middle of the valley. That thing is only several hundred yards wide. But if you can see it from Earth, you've got some exceptional seeing. Everybody loves Cassini down here too. A very strange looking crater, kind of reminds me of a Frisbee. Right square in the center of the man on the moon. Actually what forms his nose is Sinus Medii up here. A number of features here that I want to point out. See the gull wing shaped rill, Marima Hyginus right here with Hyginus Crater right in the middle. Hyginus Crater is the largest crater on the moon that is not an impact crater. It's actually a volcanic collapse pit, about 10 kilometers in diameter. And then over here, the Aridaeus rill. These rills or cracks on the moon are created by volcanism. But in this case, two different types of volcanic activity created this. This is actually a volcanic collapse to there's multiple collapse pits along the rill, but Aridaeus is what we call a graben. That's where a volcanic dike, which is a sheet of magma pushed up from under the surface of the moon and spread the surface apart, but the magma never breached the surface. All it did was create a gigantic crack. It almost looks like a highway cut for an interstate highway. Oh, there's another feature up here that I really enjoy. This dark area here, it's kind of heart-shaped, and thus I call it the heart of the moon. It's very close to the very center of the moon, and that's a mountainous region that is higher elevation, and when the volcanic activity that spewed out of the Hyginus rill 3 billion years ago spread volcanic ash all across the area. These mountains are high enough to escape later volcanic flooding that obliterated that, but the volcanic ash on these mountains makes it dark enough that it shows up and creates that heart-shaped feature. People think like Mare Imbrium, the man in the moon's left eye, is the biggest lunar sea because it's the most apparent. It's huge, circular. But actually the largest or widest Mare on the moon is also the thinnest. Mare Frigoris forms the eyebrow above the man on the moon's eyes and stretches all the way across the moon. It's very narrow, only about 150 kilometers high, but it's almost 1,600 kilometers across. It's one of the more ignored of the lunar seas, but it's also the widest. I love the sunset drama. And this picture may not be one of the more high-resolution ones that I took. The seeing was rather poor that night, but for some reason, people loved this picture. And they asked me for copies of it so they can frame it. Sunset on Archimedes crater. More evidence of volcanism on the moon. See the dark areas around the little pits? That's where volcanic ash has spewed up and showered down on the surface and darkened it. It's very much like the ongoing pyroclastic activity on Hawaiian volcanoes, where it shoots up the streamers of ash and spreads out. We can still see evidences of that. This is taken over a 2-hour period, summer of 2015. Sunrise on Ptolemaeus Crater. Like I said, over a 2-hour period, and there's a dramatic change in the shadows in the crater. And I use this picture to illustrate the moon does change hour to hour. It's not a static target. You don't look at it and say, oh, it's just a bunch of holes in the ground. It does change appearance right before your very eyes. Everybody remembers the movie 2001, and they were digging around in Clavius Bay crater and found the big monolith that took them off to Jupiter. Well, that's Clavius Crater right here. We used to think it was the biggest crater on the near side of the moon, but it's actually the second. The crater Bailey is bigger, but it's on the limb of the moon, so we can't see it that well. But everybody knows Clavius, one of the biggest craters we can see on the moon. And speaking of Clavius, when sunrise spills over its rim, it illuminates the rims of craters within Clavius and creates an effect that we call the eyes of Clavius. 2 little eyes staring out of the crater. And the crater Miletus, very similar to Tycho Crater, but we're seeing it at more of a slant. We can imagine at this extreme angle, this foreshortened angle, you can almost imagine that you're an astronaut sitting on the rim of this side of it, looking across it to see the detail in the crater wall across the crater. And lunar observers all love the straight wall. It's a feature down on the southeastern part of the moon. It's they call it straight wall, but it's actually a fairly shallow slope. It only inclines a little over 20 degrees, but at sunrise, it's enough to create a shadow. Straight wall becomes a black line feature, and when the sun gets higher, it illuminates the face of the straight wall. It becomes a white line feature. And here we have sunset on straight wall. And when I took this picture, I couldn't help but be fascinated by the prospect of standing on the rim of straight wall and watch the sunset shadows play out in the valley ahead of you and watch the sun go down on the moon. And bear in mind, the moon rotates much slower than the Earth. It takes about 2 minutes for the sun to set on Earth, but on the moon it takes an hour. Tycho Crater, another one of our favorites. It's one of the youngest large craters on the moon, formed about 108 million years ago. And when you're dealing with the moon, you're always talking about things that are billions of years old. And here we've got Tycho that's only millions. This thing was formed while there were dinosaurs on Earth. Now you back up a little bit and look at Tycho, and suddenly, yeah, there's the crater, but there's some strange things going on here. What's the deal? First of all, you notice there's this black donut around Tycho, very noticeable. What that is when Tycho, the explosion that created Tycho, the ejecta thrown out for it, flew over that zone of avoidance and crashed further out. So everything flew out of the crater and never touched right around the outside of it. So that's relatively undisturbed. The bright area is further out is where all the ejecta splashed out and plowed up and tore up the ground and tilted and made it bright. But another thing that's really curious about Tycho, we know some craters on the moon have ray systems around them. That's the material splashed out by the explosion that made it and painted across the face of the moon and created these ray streaks. Rays only last about 1 billion years on the moon before more meteoric activity erases them. So the Tychonian ray system is very bright. It's very young, but it's also extremely puzzling because you expect a ray will point back to its source, where the explosion was that threw the material out. Yet here we've got a parallel ray system we call the railroad tracks, do not come back to a focus. Each ray comes to the rim of Tycho instead of the center. And we've got this rogue ray over here that is tangential to Tycho. So if you can figure that out and write it up, you're going to get somewhere with this lunar stuff. Got to move on a little bit. We're running out of time. I'm enjoying myself talking about the moon and kept falling behind. Mare Imbrium, the moon's right eye. I put this picture up to illustrate how mountains on the moon are formed. On Earth, mountains are formed by tectonic activity where plates crush together and force up mountains, or they're built up by volcanic activity. But on the moon, mountain chains are simply the rim of a giant crater that cradles the Maria, flooded with lava, filled in or smoothed out the bottom of the basin, but the rim, the upturned edge of the crater, is what the actual now forms mountain chains on the moon. Sinus Iridum, the Bay of Rainbows, on the western part of Mare Imbrium, forms another one of these horseshoe bays. A crater formed on the rim of the basin, and lava flooded into it and smoothed it out. And we've got Dorsum Heim, another one of these wrinkle ridges that very low elevation, no more than a couple of hundred meters, but they go on for hundreds of kilometers. And when the low sun hits it, creates shadows. We can spot these things at that time. You know, there's saying in real estate, location, location, location. Same thing on the moon. We've got a tale of two craters here. Got Latrone on the upper right, upper left, a horseshoe bay type crater, and another one of those oatmeal cookie floor fractured craters on the lower right. Similar size, almost identical in initial shape, yet one of them's obliterated by lava, the other one was at a higher elevation. It escaped the lava flooding. It became a floor fractured crater, and Gassendi is one of the most beloved craters on the moon because of this fascinating rill system inside. But Latrone got flooded out and drifted off into oblivion, and Gassendi gets all the glory. Waxing gibbous moon, almost near full moon, fascinating time to observe where the Marius Hills. This is a collection of several hundred lunar domes, and right at sunrise, the shadows emphasize them. And you look in the telescope, and the moon looks like it's dimpled. There's hundreds of these things, and right at sunrise, they show up real well. And that's the end. There is much to love on the moon, and I hope you see the moon in a slightly different light now. Get a little joy out of it instead of grumbling about it being the bright light in the sky that keeps you from doing deep sky. There's much to love on the moon, and I hope you join me in enjoying it. I'd be happy to entertain a few questions.
take a closer look.
Awesome!
We can take a picture of it too.